So now we're going to open it up, and we're going to ask our speakers to sit on stage. And this microphone, I'm going to hand over to somebody else who is going to see if anybody has any questions. All right, I have an opportunity for questions. So please just raise your hand and I'll come over with the microphone. And just be shy. You can use it. Well, yeah, you can, shy people also can have questions. Oh, sorry, yes, thank you so much.
Referring to the first presentation about the sizes of towns, how do you factor in the local economic issues? If a town has a core business close, that could make a significant change. It can affect all the numbers you talked about. But how do you deal with factors like that?
Great question. And so what you saw here was the product of some conversations we had a couple months ago where people asked us to do kind of a quick analysis of this, right? And so what we wanted to do is effectively the proof of concept is to say, okay, if we were going to look at Division of Local Services data, which is the state division that looks at these things, and just try to do a kind of big picture, what would you expect to see if the kind of long-standing claims of the depressing impact of housing growth on communities were to be true, right? And so what we saw here, we have a couple other kind of cohorts of this where we're just looking at like-to-like communities. What we haven't done, and when we get to publishing something on that, would be analyzing things like economic sectors in those two communities and what's happened there as well. But I do think that when you look at the 59 or so communities in between the 20 and the 48,000 in population, by aggregating those, you should be able to kind of net out some of those community-to-community factors. So you're absolutely right. Every community is different, and you're going to have different factors that affect that. But I think when you combine them all and you start to see some of those trends, I think that's impactful. And the other thing I would say true too is the education funding piece is a reality that has become even more of a reality in recent years, in that you are simply not going to get any additional resources from the state if your enrollment's not growing. And you might say, well, that's fine, I don't need new resources from the state. But here's the other thing that has changed because of the Student Opportunity Act is, but even if your enrollment is not growing, your local required contribution will grow. What they're going to ask of you locally is going to grow, irrespective of your enrollment, whereas your state aid is going to be tied to enrollment. So that reality, I think, speaks to growth, irrespective of some of those kind of unique economic factors in any individual community.
Great, thank you. Do you have any other questions? Yeah, sure. I don't know if it's cheating, but thank you so much, Doug. I'm definitely going to have you come talk to some of my planners that I work with, because this is such a common concern that is raised. And if you have any kind of specific anecdotes of speaking to a resident and kind of managing to change their mind about this, I would love to hear a success story.
Sure, I will say that's probably less of a slam dunk case than it is demonstrating it. I think so I've had a lot of good conversations with folks on this, right? It tends to be in large groups where I don't go back and ask people how they would have voted before and after. What I will say though is my gut is that that's not really why people don't want to build housing. That's a seemingly plausible and convenient excuse to not want to build housing. And so I don't think that the end game in many of those conversations is going to be a eureka moment of, you're right, now I do want that multi-unit apartment building, a mile from me. What I think it does is clear away some of the misconceptions and really gets to the coalition building that these folks talked about, right? That's what it's going to come down to, right? Yeah, I'm a data guy, I work on data issues all the time, and I wish it was you just said, and here's X, Y, Z, and you do this, and see, you were wrong, so now you're on my side, right? But exactly as was pointed out, that's not actually how it's probably going to get people to change their mind, but I do think it's still helpful for folks to know in their advocacy that don't worry, that's not really a thing, right? It may be in an individual community, again, I don't want to dismiss that, but don't allow that to be a red herring, and instead get back to that more kind of grassroots coalition building that we talked about, that's really how you're going to probably win over communities.
All right, do you have one over here?
this is in the handbricks. Yes.
Thank you. Seriously, Doug, I thought that was a great all of you, great presentation, but Doug, I love the data. And we kind of sort of answered the question I was going to, whether it's a red area that people are using that, using the economic argument, but really they don't want it for a host of other reasons. So I guess the question I want to say is, how do you impact the business community, the community that pays a lot of the taxes in a lot of these communities, and get them to lead the charge and push this forward with the entire planning boards?
So that's a great question, and in all honesty, it's from a community to community, I feel like you folks probably can speak a little more intelligently about some of the experiences you have. Let me just say, broadly speaking, I think the business community, so we're a statewide research organization, but we're supported by a lot of large businesses and other organizations. I think that, we work very closely with Secretary Augustus and his team on many of these issues, right? Because I do think there's a recognition that at a macro level, we've got to make sure we build more housing, and that means we've got to build housing in our communities. From a community to community standpoint, though, let me hand the mics over to you guys to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I think we covered it briefly. Like I said, we weren't able to get into the meat of everything, but understanding that as a business owner, you have a vested interest in advancing affordable housing. You have a workforce that relies on the development and the production of housing that is affordable. It is something that is in your interest. So if you're able to not only convince the business community that advancing per housing agendas is part of their interest, but also convincing them that it is important for them to convince those around them, I think that you're able to build that big tent coalition that Whitney was talking about. I work very closely with folks in Needham, which I don't think is a same example to the community that you guys are, but it is a like example. And folks like Greg Reedman at the Chamber are galvanizing business leaders across all of those regions because they have the interest. They need the workforce. They want to retain the people that are able to live there. And you have people that own smaller businesses that are being pushed out of the communities that don't have the foot traffic that they need. So you have to find the part of the pro-affordable housing agenda that aligns with that person that can get them to sign on and then tell their buddies and their buddies' buddies that, hey, this is something we should get behind.
That's fantastic. I couldn't say it better myself. And at CHAPA, we've been trying to put that at the forefront of our work through our Affordable Massachusetts campaign, right? Bringing together those buddies like Greg Friedman and others who have an understanding of the economic development and the ability to thrive and how housing is central to that. So we'll invite those sort of business leaders to be part of that conversation and really see themselves as leaders in that way, making those strong connections and seeing the health industry and the service industry and the hospitals all part of this larger coalition that's working on that and making those connections broadly.
And just one other, I was on a panel with Rachel Heller from CHAPA a couple weeks ago, and she mentioned that it may have been in Needham, like a coffee shop owner who was super, I think, effective in talking about the need for the workforce. So I think that I'm sure if you reach out to CHAPA or they can connect you with people who do that well. The other thing I would say is I can't speak for the Greater Lowell Chamber. I haven't talked to them about this, but I know Charles River Chamber, a lot of chambers, and it may absolutely be that the Greater Lowell Chamber is here on this as well. Understands this because it's so central to economic growth in the region, right? To make sure that people have the workforce they can. And so it's worth reaching out to whoever your chamber is, or the network of chambers of Massachusetts, to ask them, because they're the most connected to some of the business owners who are in the community. So that would be a recommendation as well.
All right, we have a question over here.
Hello, Felice Tripolo of Massing. So my understanding is the largest shortage of housing, if you look at it by income, is for those with extremely low poverty, so those below 30% of area median income. And so, right, as far as I know, there's really no good carrots or sticks, but maybe I'm wrong, around that particular subset of housing getting that built. So I'm wondering how we could get more of that housing, period, and also how it can be built in a way that achieves goals related to deconcentrating poverty and for really furthering fair housing related to that federal law.
That's a big one.
How do we fix the problem?
So it's a huge challenge, right? And I will say that the Affordable Homes Act that Secretary Augustus talked about, you may be very aware of, right? So this is a housing bond bill in Massachusetts. It's got about $5.1 billion in authorizations over the next 5 years. We'll actually spend less than that, but I think we've already seen from the Healy-Driscoll administration a significant increase in what the state spends on housing supports, right? And that comes in a few different forms, but the primary forms are to make it easier to invest in housing developments that have an affordability component, some of which have a deep affordability component, not all of them, some are a little higher. And so there's a few different tools to try to do that in the Affordable Homes Act. The state does a lot of them, right? So, you know, housing authorities have engaged in public-private partnerships to kind of, you know, deconcentrate poverty and combine market rate housing with low-income housing. But if you're going to cross-subsidize very low-income housing in a market rate development, especially in an interest rate environment like this, cost environment like this, a lot of those projects just don't pencil out right now, right? That's been the kind of reality in recent years, or the last couple of years. But the Healy-Driscoll administration also included a provision called the Momentum Fund, right? So they're trying, and what the Momentum Fund is attempting to do is use a mix of state and private dollars to kind of provide some actual equity investment where the state isn't going to be looking for the same payoff that a private investor would be looking for. And so potentially you could move the needle on some of those projects that wouldn't otherwise happen. Again, that's not all deeply affordable housing units, right? And I do think that part of it is about, you don't want to be in a place where you say just build market rate housing and it'll solve the problem for everyone, because even if that was true, it would take years and years and years and years. But I do think production in and of itself is helpful, especially dense production. And I think the Healy-Driscoll administration has been very proactive in trying to create some new tools to further incentivize deeply affordable housing, but it is challenging, right? And we don't control all of that, right? It also has to do with larger economic factors and things like that.
And I guess I will add, and this is not popular opinion, but we have folks like Doug and we have folks at a state level that understand how the money flows and they understand what funding is behind programs. But a lot of the conversations that you're having on the ground are talking about the effectiveness of those programs. So understanding what did and didn't work in the past 5 to 10 years, or what we need to change and reform, and bringing it back up to the top. So again, like Doug was saying, yes, it's about the money and it's about the taxes and it's about the funding, but it's also about the people and understanding how we can recycle or throw away the things that aren't working. So it's coalition and money at the same time.
And I think this does get back to MBTA communities a little bit. And you know, CHAPA talks about MBTA communities far more than I do. But to me, what's interesting about it is it a perfectly drawn bill in terms of weighting incentives? Who knows? And like every community is different and every community is challenging. But at the end of the day, what's it doing? It's trying to create an incentive for communities to reduce zoning barriers to development. Now, not just affordable development, but development in general. And at the end of the day, the state doesn't have the resources. Your communities don't have the resources to just pay for this housing themselves, right? We're not going to be able to just use public resources to pay for all this stuff. We have to use kind of a multi-step approach, one of which is incentivizing communities to make it easier to build affordable housing and other housing. So that's where a law like, I think that's why you see such energy around trying to make this work, because if we can't create some incentives to get folks to create more housing production friendly zoning, we don't have another silver bullet to bring to bear on this, right? So I think that's why you have such a focus on building the coalitions to do that.
But I have no like. Yeah.
Let's give it up for Whitney, Doug, and Sadé. Thank you so much for those excellent words of wisdom and sharing your expertise with all of us in the room, and for, of course, making yourselves available should we have additional questions and follow-up.